I believe we can now start. So, hello everyone. Welcome to today's weekly hour of the Blue Mission Atlantic and Arctic. My name is Ana Faria. I'm a member of the Blue Mission AA at the Air Center. And today's weekly hour will be focused on developing specific governance options for an effective management of marine ecosystems. And our panel of experts today includes Oliver Wilson from the Marine Institute in Ireland and Sebastian Kopp from the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. They bring their expertise in ocean governance and marine conservation, and they play a critical role supporting the Blue Mission AA in Work Package 1, which is related to the mission governance and implementation in the Atlantic and the Arctic. So thank you, Oliver and Sebastian, for putting this webinar together. And I'll leave now the floor to you, Oliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. So Sebastian's just going to share his screen first and just show a video for all participants. But firstly, thank you to everyone for joining today. Looking forward to an engaging and informative session. Over to you, Sebastian.
The Atlantic and Arctic oceans are vital to our planet, nurturing ecosystems that provide life and support for millions of people. But these oceans are facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change, pollution, and overfishing threaten their health and our future. The BlueMissionAA project is stepping in to tackle those challenges, with a clear mission to restore and protect our waters.
BlueMissionAA is an EU-funded project under the Restore Our Ocean and Waters by 2030 mission dedicated to safeguarding our European seas and rivers. With a singular focus on protecting and restoring marine and coastal ecosystems, BlueMissionAA is leading the charge to build a connection hub to support the mission implementation in the Arctic and Atlantic basin.
The objective of BlueMissionAA is clear: to engage every organization and individual we can to reach the goal of protecting 30% of marine ecosystems, with 10% under strict protection. This ambitious goal is not just about numbers. It's about ensuring health and resilience of the ocean for future generations. To achieve these goals, BlueMissionAA has structured its effort around 5 core activities: build and mobilize governance frameworks, develop and deploy a comprehensive monitoring and reporting framework, develop a catalog of innovation solutions and a dynamic entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem, and engage and empower citizens to contribute to the mission and boost society uptake of new solutions.
Thank you all very much for joining today. We are very excited to go into a dialogue today. Over the past year and longer, both Oliver, both the Air Center, both the Marine Institute, NIVA, and multiple partners have worked together to bring this into practice, what we are going to talk today about. So I'm very excited to share this stage today with Mr. Oliver Wilson, representing also the Marine Institute in Ireland, state agency responsible for marine research, as Anna has referred to him just now. Welcome, Oliver. How are you doing today, this morning, noon, or evening, depending on where we are from?
Great, thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks again for everyone for joining today. I've just shared my screen for the presentation, but I think it just the video provides a great insight for everybody in terms of the overarching goals and ambitions of the project itself. But specifically, the objective of this particular webinar is to support us in Work Package 1. Our work package is focused around governance and governance specifically around the marine restoration. And so the Atlantic Lighthouse, as touched on in the video, is part of the Restore Our Ocean and Waters by 2030, and Work Package 1 is very much building on all of the hard work of other sections within our consortium and the work that has come before in terms of establishing a framework for effective governance across the lighthouse. We're focusing today on the passive restoration, but the project itself covers both passive and active restoration. For those that are aware of the new nature restoration law, the restoration itself gives us the ability, the nature restoration law itself gives us the ability to encompass NPAs as passive, and then active restoration more when people are going out and planting mangroves or kelp, for example. So today, what we want to talk about is the process we've been working through so far, and then how we're going to achieve this proposals for new effective governance to the EU moving forward. So I guess the question is what the rationale is for charting this new course. We're looking at developing a very much an impact-focused approach to governance and very much an impact focus with ecosystems at the center of this. The governance structure, in our view, if it's working well, will empower and facilitate success of others. It provides the framework, the decision-making framework for others to implement their activities and provide feedback loops and research and science and innovation, but to make sure that we do it in an accountable, transparent and impactful way. The key from our perspective as part of BlueMissionAA, moving from what we are in phase 1 of the mission to phase 2, where it's about upscaling and deployment, is that we are proposing or developing within the current project new governance structures that enable us to move from not just research and innovation, but actually into business as usual. And the governance structures are fundamental, and we'll come onto that later on in the presentation. So I guess one of the key questions at this point would be, what is the key driver for a project like this? And so for us, ultimately, the driver is producing an enduring legacy, whereby we have an enduring framework to enable others to succeed. But we have the liberty in our project to actually be thought provokers, identify new angles and approaches to a certain extent, an out-of-box thinking within reason. And so we're using this opportunity for you to engage with us to help influence or direct some of our thinking as we expand our ideas to provide those to the EU in the future. So in terms of what we're actually doing, our process is developing 3 steps. Our first step was to complete 2 key reports where we identified observations, reflections, and golden nuggets from specific sites. And so the first report was a baseline study on the legal frameworks and institutions within the Atlantic and Arctic. And the second report was very much looking at site-specific projects to actually try to identify where the governance structures were actually whether or not they were translating into local restoration sites. As part of developing those 2 reports, we defined governance parameters around strategic direction, legal framework, implementation as the 3 key parameters or pillars of the governance, of which people is all encompassing and covers all of that. Our work in those particular reports really focused around governance as the process of decision making and by which decisions are actually implemented. So what we've done for this presentation is actually try to show you, give you some examples of a quick synthesis rather than us tell you about these very big and comprehensive reports that we spent a lot of time doing, but actually give you a bit of an example or synthesis utilizing hopefully a slightly more engaging methodology. So this is an AI generated synthesis of our report.
I'm coming in here as it, at least on my end, appears that that's not audible. We have already managed to get it back up. So I will share the video on this in this time.
Thanks, Sebastian. I'll stop sharing if you share from your end. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you. And I'm encouraging our viewers again to take a close listen and to think about questions that you may have had last night, maybe the night before. What does keep you awake at night when it comes to passive restoration? Have a listen, and then we'll be back soon in 4 minutes.
I'm sorry, Sebastian. We are not listening.
You're also not hearing. That is unfortunate.
I'm really sorry.
But that is life sometimes turns out to be one way or another way. What we can do alternatively is basically to raise a few questions ourselves and things that we noted. And I'm going to share my video again here. Things that we noted over the past months and past year that might be an issue and that we would like to tackle. One of this is financing. Financing often is a key issue when it comes to protecting an area not only for today and tomorrow, but also for today in a few months, today in a year, today in 10 years. Ecosystems are changing. They don't only exist today, but we also want them to exist in 30 years. The Earth at some point might survive, but whether humans can survive is the other questions. In order for humans to survive, we need an environment, and so we need also financing to have prolonged support. That was considered a key issue both in the expert panel we thankfully had in the support of the work here. And also that was mentioned by different stakeholders. So financing as one key point. Another key point is often legal and policy areas are taking care of nature or are trying to take care of nature in a zonal approach. What does this mean? For example, marine protected areas often are areas, legally, zonally defined areas. But nature is changing. So if the ocean warms, are there still the same species? Are there still the same fish, the same other creatures living there, or does this area move? How effective is it to have an area-based zonal management system, or should we move beyond this to something else? These are two key points, and Oliver knows the deep dives into these and into a lot further. And I know, Ollie, you have prepared even further slides to go even deeper into this. So one question of me towards you would be, what type of work have you been doing over the last months? Can you share a little bit about the insights that you got from this? Over to you, Ollie.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sebastian. Unfortunately, as we move into AI, it doesn't always work perfectly, but thank you for bearing with us. I guess one key question before I move into what we're doing is actually a question that we ask ourselves within our project, and I think it's pertinent for all researchers, is actually has this work not been done before? And I guess the key from our perspective is building on the work that has been done before and not looking to reinvent the wheel. Now, I have for the last over a decade been living in New Zealand and have recently relocated back to the Northern Hemisphere. And there's a common Maori proverb which describes the notion of walking backwards into the future. So the context there is that the past is clearly visible, but the future is not. And so we have imperfect information about what is to come, but we know what has come before. And so the key from our perspective is utilizing and understanding what has come before to make us better informed as we make decisions into the future, noting that we're not seeking to make the future identical to the past, but in actually improve our marine governance in this context. And the other aspect I would state in terms of has this work not been done before is equally leveraging off of another proverb: the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now. And so we absolutely recognize that there has been lots of work in this space. But I think what I want to do as we work through what we're doing, emphasize what else is happening, because we're very cognizant of the bigger picture and the bigger amount of research that is happening within not just both Europe but worldwide.
So Ollie, then let us inform us, please, about like what kind of trees are there, which trees, and do they make up a full forest, or do we need another picture?
So I think what our observations from the work that we've done today, so the data inputs that you can see here, unfortunately it's fragmented and siloed, and I think we've identified that. And you'll identify, for those that are engaged in Europe, there is a big push from the European Commission at the moment about policy coherence. We currently have a consultation around the Ocean Pact, for example. And then we have also consultations around changes to the common fisheries policy. So emphasis on the need to address some long-standing fragmentation, or how we increase recognition of ecosystem or ecosystem-based managing as part of legal structures for particular sectors. And obviously renewable energies is a huge emerging sector. So the observations we've made is that we need to see how we can pull those together. And there's been some interesting reports recently about demonstrating about the extent of spatial squeeze and the need for mixed use areas, or much more concerted holistic planning when we move forward, even to the extent France is a good example, where they have just recently finished a consultation where they've actually pulled together marine spatial planning and the Water Framework Directive. So they're recognizing the need to address that land water interface as part of their planning processes. So the area that noting all of that bigger context, I wanted to say just identify for you that we're going to be talking about this engagement, and as I said, hopefully any feedback you have or just ongoing discussions, this is the start of a process, will help inform these proposals through to the EU. And so the key discussion areas that came out from our reports, and then subsequent discussions with experts, as Sebastian alluded to. The key discussion areas were ecosystem-based management, policy alignment, and evidence-based supported decision-making. And what we're proposing is actually quite a significant shift in terms of ecosystem-based management, not to the concept of it, because there are lots of projects existing. For example, MPA Europe is currently a European project mapping biodiversity hotspots, and we have Marine Plan, which is another European project that just produced a very engaging report about ecosystem, the toolbox to implement ecosystem-based management. But we're looking at it from the concept of redefining the strategic direction. At the moment, our targets are internationally set through the CBD based on conservation of biological diversity, based on percentages. So we're aiming for 30% protection. But we, from our work that we've done to date, will look to redefine that and actually make it ecologically based. So redefine it so that our targets and our vision is set by percentages per ecological region as a management unit, but not at the EEZs, which is the current management unit. Equally, we have the percentages. So again, we're building on what has come before, but look to translate those percentages into a much more meaningful target. For example, are we looking to, do we have a baseline of our current biodiversity. What are we seeking? Are we looking to improve our biodiversity, for example, by 15% from a recognized baseline year? If you look at other international agreements, if you look at, for example, about in terms of our climate goals, we have very much we've got our goals, but we've tied them into a specific 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial. So the pre-industrial acts as a baseline. We don't have a comparative baseline when we talk about biodiversity. In terms of policy alignment, I touched on it with regards to how France is implementing at a national level, but at a regional level, we're looking at how we can strengthen integrated maritime policy. It completely aligned with some of the thinking that's happening within the EU at the moment in terms of the discussions around the Ocean Pact. And then we're looking at how we develop a strategic entity within the Atlantic and within the Arctic. Now, we are absolutely conscious of the issues, geopolitics at the moment. And so we are trying to look at proposing pragmatic, not just unrealistic suggestions moving forward. And then I touched on earlier the evidence-supported decision making. We currently don't have standardized terminology or standardized approaches to how we are defining biodiversity health, nor indeed how we set a baseline for biodiversity health and what we are seeking to achieve collectively. So I just wanted to summarize before moving on the principles behind our ideas, which I've touched on already, but just to really emphasize that we see marine spatial planning as a primary management tool that the governance would lean on and the governance would support. Biodiversity is the baseline. The baseline is largely due to the fact that our project is focused on restoring the ocean, so naturally we would have biodiversity as the baseline. It does not exclude the fact that we are very aware that we need to account for socio-economic and cultural considerations and there will be a lot of trade-offs and opportunity costs required and discussions required when looking at a strategic approach to marine spatial planning. The other aspect at this point I think we should emphasize, in the past, when we talk about marine restoration, we always talk about 30%, but largely, and presentations by some of our expert panel actually at UN Ocean Decade, for example, identified that we should really be talking about 100% management. 100% management in terms of this marine spatial planning, and then within that is our goals, our specific biodiversity goals, as well as aligning or trading off our biodiversity goals in some ecological regions or some states with the need for energy security and food security, for example. In terms of the work that we are currently doing, our proposal approach is that we are taking those key discussion areas I just identified, and then we are conducting a PESO analysis as a systematic insight, and then we're developing a SOAR analysis to look at where all the strengths and opportunities lie, and then from that developing a theory of change, how we can actually pragmatically achieve the changes that we're proposing to the EU, and we'll be developing or continuing to develop causal loops to identify drivers and barriers. And it's the causal loops. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of where we've got to with those. And as Sebastian and Anna mentioned, please do raise your hand and get involved if you have any specific questions as we move through the process. In terms of implemented enduring governance change, I want to emphasize this shift from EEZs. So many of you will be aware where the EEZs are, but just to put up a map, and then if you actually translate where those EEZs are into ecosystems, this is the ICES ecoregions, including their statistical areas. But you can see that those ecoregions transboundary, they're not defined by the EEZs. And as I say, there are existing projects at the moment really delving into biodiversity hotspots, which will be even more informative. The key from our perspective is shifting a management unit from a EEZ to an ecosystem or eco-region. And BlueMissionAA was recently at an Arctic Frontiers, or the title of their conference in Tromsø was Beyond Borders. And I think this emphasizes we know where our EEZs are, but now we have these borders. I think the key is to make meaningful impact and to go beyond these borders and actually implement it from an ecosystem-based approach. However, as you can see, these are the ICES areas, but the large marine ecosystem boundaries that are used like for states such as Norway, these boundaries do not align with the ICES area. So we do have an issue in terms of clearly defining our boundaries and our scope. The scope, for example, we're talking about marine ecosystems, but the scope could should very much account for inputs from the catchment areas, river catchment basins that are coming into our oceans as part of understanding our changes in the ecosystem and the biodiversity. And so, as I mentioned, in terms of the evidence supported, is a key about having baseline mapping and being very impact driven. At the moment, we are driven by percentages, but there's a wealth of scientific literature out there that emphasizes that whilst we might achieve our percentages, there's no guarantee that we put them in the marine protection in the best areas, nor are we getting best use out of our limited space. As we get increasing spatial squeeze and competition, we're going to have to be planning to optimize our space for all users, including nature as a key user in this. These are I wanted to just conceptualize what I mean when I say baseline. And so these are conceptual graphs. They're not from any specific data or driving, but I want to emphasize in the top row countries with the ecosystem assessments that ICES do, or the specific work that Norway does, for example, in terms of its large marine ecosystems. We have a range of indicators, or biodiversity indicators, ecosystem indicators, and they can show changes in time. What people are starting to do, and the scientific literature shows this, is that what we're starting to do is monitor these trends over time. And we're suggesting that you can either use these changing indicators as a proxy for overarching ecosystem health, or use combined biodiversity baselines. The intent of that being that then a decision can be made on where we consider the baseline, year zero, to be for biodiversity. And then once you've defined where your year zero is, based on a time series, incorporating all of the data that you have, such as the integrated assessments, we can then add a biodiversity target on top of it. For those that have done any work in fisheries, for example, this is quite a common process where you would use abundance indicators or status indicators, and then you apply your baseline across a period of time. This is more a combination of qualitative and quantitative, and then you add a target on top of that. And so therefore you actually can determine, when we put a new marine area in, or we protect a particular hotspot, we can track it over time to actually see what benefit we're having. It allows us to be more dynamic, as Sebastian said, about reflecting that fixed lines on a map and not necessarily going to be sufficient with climate change. So working at an ecosystem region in terms of percentage coverages, and then working at an ecosystem in terms of potential changes, enables us to be a bit more adaptable in terms of climate change.
Let me jump in here, Oliver.
Yeah.
This is a lot of information. It's a lot of graphs. Do I get this right, that what you're describing here is to take either already existing indicators or further indicators and combine them then to one? What's the reasoning behind that? Is the reasoning that you want then to have a combined indicator that is easier to understand and has more value to say? And how do you manage the combination of these aspirations with the practical realities that are being faced with the current landscape and the future for marine restoration? How do you see this the value here, and how do you combine the aspirations that you have with the practicalities?
Thanks, Sebastian. So it very much is building on indicators that are already existing. Norway has a framework and has indicators that it uses currently. ICES has a range of different indicators that it uses for its integrated ecosystem assessments. We've got papers that are just recently published in Nature, for example, about how to, through the Marine Plan project, about indicators. And indeed, as part of BlueMissionAA, we are developing key performance indicators for restoration sites ourselves. So there's a wealth of indicators. I think what we need to do is coalesce all of that information, weave the strands together to get agreed regional at the Atlantic and Arctic level, so that we can have agreed indicators and agreed science. The key, or the reason for this, is that to get political will, we need political pressure. And to build political pressure, you need to give a rationale around how your activities are impactful, making a change, and how they're important to decision makers and to local communities. And so at the moment, we do have examples around the world where you would put a park in, but we don't know what the status of the biodiversity was when a marine protection area went in. It's then potentially not monitored or enforced. And so we don't know what the change has been over a period of time. And so it's impossible to say if that has been impossible to be very specific about the benefits. Now, there's lots of research about the benefits of marine protected areas generally, but there's lots of science that put in that we can't say at a national or then at a regional level about what the actual biodiversity change has been. And I think it comes back to a strategic direction. Why are we setting percentages to the side? I think the key for setting areas aside is because we want to improve biodiversity, or at least not let it degrade any further. So we need to be able to monitor that, and that's the concept behind putting these specific targets in, and it makes us more accountable to those targets as well. Your point about the realism of doing this, I'll touch on in a second, actually.
Thank you. And in the meantime, let me thank also the audience who is putting in first questions here, which is noted. Thank you. And I want to encourage you again to put in even further questions, maybe also a directed question on the future, on the current. What is keeping you awake at night when it comes to marine restoration? What could be fixed with the work that we do? What would you like to see? You have here the expert work package lead for the governance in BlueMissionAA. So take this chance and ask Ollie every question and pressure him on some of the points. Back to you, Ollie.
Thank you. So in terms of your question around realities, the reality is that the biodiversity that we're proposing is the baseline. But we do have to account for socioeconomic and cultural considerations. And so that means it's really important we put those sectoral overlays. And so what we are proposing as a process and putting the governance around these processes is making sure that we have maps of distribution of both biodiversity and sectoral use, so that we can map the key conflict areas. And so just do that both in terms of distribution, and then subsequently, after we have done it by distribution, actually put a valuation on it as well. So you can put monetary values to aid decision makers. Now, obviously there's a process there in terms of how you define the monetary values, but that's, again, from our perspective, we're not seeking to give all of the answers down in the detail, but very much provide the framework that enables those processes to happen. And so by putting the overlays and the valuation, then we can start mapping out where our biodiversity hotspots are, where our use hotspots are. And so then we can start identifying key conflict areas that may or may not need multi-use solutions. We can also identify where there's no conflict and therefore is an easier decision-making process for local communities or regional decision-making. Equally, it means that we can identify how we can optimize through scenarios and modeling, how we can optimize achieving our biodiversity targets through the EU's biodiversity targets, the EU's renewable targets, food production targets, to again provide that food security and energy security aspects. Referring back to the point that Sebastian said about climate change, in addition to providing the status now, what we need to be doing is also using tools to determine where the biodiversity is going to shift to, or indeed where fish stocks are going to move to, so we can also predict into the future, so we can set up areas not just for now but into the future where we might need to protect for predicted new biodiversity hotspots or new predicted areas that will be important into the future for energy security. Now, combining those two aspects provides all of the data at a regional level, at an ecosystem level, and then so that's providing much more of a top-down approach, and then the decision would be to then translate at a national level to engage and develop co-governance, which I will come on to shortly, in terms of building a more hybrid approach with some bottom-up at a more national level. Now, the reason I put up this, what some might call a horrendogram, is really to identify and show to the audience the causal maps that we are developing at present. And in terms of the things that we've talked about, we're just identifying the ecosystem boundaries, the fact that we need to incorporate this mountains to sea approach, have holistic data inputs, and then the need for baseline mapping, as I said, to actually know what our impact has been moving forward. And then the development of these impact-driven targets, which will very much be at a regional level. That then is that top-down approach in terms of setting those targets, just like we do with CBD. Now, it's not looking to, I want to really emphasize, we're not suggesting we don't have the percentage targets. It's more that we're translating the percentage targets into a much more impact-driven target within those percentages, but that the percentages are very much based on ecosystems, not on EEZs. And then, as I just discussed, the need for that overlay, sectoral overlay, incorporating all different targets and aspirations that the EU has. Well, not just the EU, but the Atlantic and Arctic within our lighthouse, and then applying those and adding those valuations over the top so that we can inform decision making. Now, the decision making itself comes from mapping these conflict areas, and then essentially what we anticipate that once you have those conflict areas, we'll need to run a whole load of scenarios of trade-offs between each of those ecological, economic, social and cultural aspirations between different states, regionally between different states, and also locally compared to a national level. And that's where the decision-making bodies come in. And so we've started, in addition to that, in terms of the decision-making bodies, we've started doing some thinking about how we might implement decision-making bodies, the governance side of things. And so through some of the discussions around the Ocean Pact, we think there's some potential to incorporate a new EU body within the integrated maritime planning within the EU, or at least strengthen those discussions between different DGs. And then within the Arctic, there's a couple of different options. One, you could advance the Arctic Forum or the Arctic Council of Ministers as different options to strengthen discussions. Again, very much recognising the geopolitics in all of these cases. But to demonstrate some of our thinking, I think a key aspect of this is a need, in terms of our scope with Atlantic and Arctic, is for a need for transboundary agreements between the Atlantic and Arctic regions. if you look at the Mediterranean, they have the Barcelona Convention, which helps with MSP. And then if you look at in the Baltic region, we have HELCOM, and then obviously VASAP, which looks at much more MSP and coordination. And we've just recently got the establishment of the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative, which is very much looking at how to coordinate marine spatial planning and incorporate cumulative impacts, for example. So we have all of the fundamentals there that we can build on, but very much what we see in the Atlantic and Arctic is to bring those together in a coherent governance framework moving forward that has an enduring legacy. And so we're looking at both those aspects and also accounting for how we might incorporate already international bodies within the Atlantic and Arctic, such as OSPAR, for example. But then when we look at a regional level, that's very much that top-down approach that I suggested. They produce the maps and the hotspots and the sectoral overlays in terms of value at a regional or ecosystem level. And then the key is translating that from a national and local level. And what we've seen is the use through our work today is the use of citizen assemblies, such as those used in Ireland that had a citizen assembly around biodiversity, or indeed those used in France where they talk about having local sea parliaments. Now our view here is the top down of all of the information to the national level, and then examples that have been done, for example, in New Zealand, is that when they were looking for areas of interest, they actually went out to local communities and stakeholders and asked them what were areas of particular significant interest that they identified, based on some information was provided to them. That empowers those local stakeholders, communities, to actually identify areas that they think are important, building on the information that comes down from the regions in terms of that evidence-based approach I discussed earlier. And so this is our conceptual model at the moment in terms of how we address this co-governance. And the discussion really is about co-governance. At what point are we moving from direct democracy to representative democracy? We very much see co-governance as joint decision making. So our what we have seen to date with citizen assemblies or the sea parliaments is more advisory bodies or consultation processes. It's advisory information, not necessarily having a co-decision making role. And so we are looking at how that might in reality be enhanced. And then very much down to the local level and building on the work that colleagues at UCC and NEVA did around sites and our experiences to develop these golden nuggets, as we call them. We are currently investigating the potential for how MPAs can have legal agency, or each individual have a legal agency, whether that be have a legal management authority, or whether that be a council that has legal agency for areas within its region. And the rationale there being that having legal agency supports its implementation, its funding. It enables us to have discussions with how to raise capital, because you're raising capital off of a legal entity. It also allows the discussion around rights for nature. And so the rights for nature, if it's a legal entity, that the management authority speaks on behalf of that particular marine protected area, and so then you can be involved in legal cases or around any decisions that might impact the MPA and its biodiversity and its value. Again, that links to the need for ecosystem accounting. So when you're in that legal context, having the valuation on what the MPA provides means that you can also then leverage potential capital or insurance around the value of the area and how you might then build up investment. Because what we have found is that individual MPAs struggle to maintain funding and have sustainable funding, which, as Sebastian alluded to, and as I touched on earlier, does potentially end up with paper parks as opposed to meaningful areas that are demonstrating that impact more moving forward. Equally, establishing those management authorities means that there's actually accountability and transparency about how they are being managed. Now, many of you will be aware that we already have to have management plans for marine protected areas, and equally with the nature restoration law, we're going to have restoration plans. And so it's a case of how we can strengthen that legislation and that framework, incorporate that, and whether or not moving individual MPAs or clusters of MPAs, a network of MPAs, to having a legal agency will strengthen their implementation moving forward. Now, I want to leave you with this last slide, allowing some time for discussion and questions that I know Sebastian's been monitoring. So thank you for those that have submitted. Where this is a process, our project doesn't finish until later this year, and so we are having continual discussions. And if would be certainly interested if anyone wants to reach out to continue discussions about some of our thought process. But some of the areas that we're still looking into is about how that we can implement this across all areas and all scales, how we utilize the sustainable funding models, working with other lighthouses, and indeed the work we're doing within our own lighthouse, where we're looking at sustainable financing models and how we can set up a governance structure that enables that rather than gets in the way of funding models, and that links into the funding of monitoring programs and how we can utilize technology moving forward. The digitization, also we have the EU digital twin, we have digital MSP, marine spatial plans online, and how we can also look to utilize technology from a monitoring aspect as well, so it's more effective and efficient. And then the incorporation of those, as I touched on, the co-governance, looking at where co-governance is appropriate, whether that's just be at a local site level or does it go all the way up to a national level. Obviously, it comes back to that discussion about moving from direct democracy to representative. Is co-governance achieved through stakeholders having representatives that keep engaging at higher spatial scales, at ecosystem scales? And then a key driver from our perspective is the utilization of intergenerational, or addressing intergenerational justice and representation, making sure we have youth voice at these meetings. Now, they're the things that we're continually thinking on about, as well as the work that we've done to date, and we're absolutely open for ongoing discussions. But what I'd like to leave you with in terms of a difficulty that we have moving forward, I think, in terms of how we establish these governance frameworks, is that we're unfortunately a paradox, or a key conflict area really is the fact that we have urgency. There is an urgency around what we need to do, but the reality is the timeframes to which we're dealing with don't align. So, for example, we know we need to act. We have these targets, these percentage targets by 2030, but we also know that putting an MPA is not going to get us a result in 1 year, 2 years. And so to monitor what impact we're having, we do need that longevity, which comes back to our point about monitoring programs, having an enduring legacy of our project, and also governance frameworks. We can't expect to see immediate changes in the ecosystem, but we do need to set up a system that means we can monitor those changes moving forward. The question and the issues that will have to be made by decision makers is how many decisions you make now due to the urgency of the situation, with a knowledge that we are long-term planning, long-term thinking. I just leave you with another experience from my time in New Zealand. We have businesses here that talk about business planning in 5 to 10 years. Businesses, indigenous thinking, Maori thinking from some of their businesses, is they're doing business planning for 100 years plus. And so I think we need to consider that when we're looking at our governance models, because we won't get immediate changes, and nor should we necessarily aim for that. What we're aiming for is enduring changes for generations to come. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Oliver. I am thankful both to you and to all those who have put in questions. As information, as you do see the QR code here, and please either screenshot and take a screenshot or use your phone. Take the chance of getting this. There's valuable information here. And also, I want to give the floor to some of the questions basically that were asked. Specifically, I would like to start with a term that you introduced also to the discussion here called co-governance. How would you understand co-governance? And I believe you have a particular view on this of what you do not want to be understood as co-governance and what you would like to be understood as co-governance. Can you go into a little bit of more detail there?
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, so I think there's a conflation of these terms, absolutely, and it concerns me. I think the conflation is when people talk about co-governance. Predominantly, lots of these discussions are actually about co-management. So what they're talking about is the implementation of an area. They're talking about how do we monitor, how do we collect data, how do we plan some research for the next couple of years. It's the management, it's the day-to-day management of a particular area. What they aren't talking about is the decision. So the decision, from my perspective, the co-governance is when you're at the table making the strategic direction decisions. You're at the table receiving the feedback from the day-to-day management, the implementation of a site, and then deciding on the strategic direction moving forward. You are influencing the direction of travel. That, to me, is co-governance. That's co-decision making. And I think if I use the citizen assembly example, there's very much a co-design there, or a co-initiation process of potentially an area, but the point in which an area is established, the advice from the citizen assembly may or may not be taken up. And so therefore it's more of an informative role, not necessarily a co-governance. And I'll leave you with one other example. When working in New Zealand, I have had examples, and I'm sure there are others as well, whereby a consultation will come out with lines on a map already established. And so at that point, it's really a consultation process. They've skipped the co-design and the co-identification, and then it really negates the ability to do the co-governance. What we're trying to seek, and we're investigating at the moment, is all those maps I discussed around hotspots and values, is that once you get to a national level, you give the ability to co-design those down at a local and integrating the targets and the visions, but very much at each level, people are in the decision-making roles, not just the management, the day-to-day management. I think we need to be very careful there.
Let me be the devil's advocate here. Why would we need real co-governance here, as you call it? Why doesn't the other one suffice? Why doesn't co-design suffice? Why should marine areas have a special say? Why should their citizens have a special say compared to, for example, youth policies or financial other policies? Why should, when it comes to marine things, why should their people have a special say?
I think it's a really pertinent question. I'd probably expand it as well, because I don't think it's about a special say for marine protection per se. It's about having a special say for 100% management of the oceans, as I referred to. So the co-governance is actually having all stakeholders, not just those that are particularly invested in marine protected areas, but all stakeholders having a say in how the marine space is used, and a co-decision. It does a co-decision and then co-governance in terms of strategic direction. It does raise the question, as I said, about at what point do representatives move that forward, just like we have MPs that represent our views, who are voted in and then represent the views as a democracy basis, as opposed to direct democracy. The benefit of having co-governance at a much more local level is that you're empowering communities, you're building that level of ownership, of investment in an area. It informs people, they become educated. We have ocean literacy improving, people making decisions about what they want in their own areas. That then leads into that political will and that political pressure. And again, I emphasize, not just from a biodiversity protection basis, but just the management of the marine space. We know we have to address climate change. We know we have to address food security and energy transition, clean green energy transition, but we need people to be invested and bought into that. You can achieve that through co-governance. You're right. There's so many papers about whether or not co-governance is the best way to do it, whether it's top down or bottom up. What we have found to date is that it seems to be a hybrid model would be the most effective moving forward. There will be a level at which you would require decisions to be made that you're not always going to be at the table at. And I would suggest that that's at the regional transboundary level.
Thank you for the answer. Let me pressure you a little bit more on this and refer to another question that we got here. When you say like who should be at the table, I'm thinking about the question in Q&A, which comes to where does the role of MPA managers fit into your project and design? Do they fit into co-governance, co-design? Do they fit into the beginning, into the middle, into the end? Where do you see MPA managers fit in perfectly, or do they fit in there?
Thanks for the question. So MPA managers will naturally have a role in the management and a very integral role. Now, I think they'll be absolutely integral in the role of providing feedback loops that inform new directions. And what we're proposing is not to remove the existing lines on a map, but more look to how we can advance moving forward. So the knowledge of those that come before us, as I alluded to, absolutely should be incorporated. Equally, the existing lines on a map should be incorporated. It's more about how we develop a governance structure for future planning and multi-use. In terms of the governance, it's a stakeholder-driven process, certainly at a local level, and absolutely MPAs managers, like anybody, would be an engaged citizen and also an informed stakeholder would absolutely need to be engaged at that certainly that local level. With then obviously that discussion as it moves up the chain in terms of spatial scale is obviously probably needs more discussion.
So let me then ask you about the legal flexibility. When you change scales, when you stay at the same scale, when you change things, when it comes to the legal flexibility, do we need a static nature, or can we change things? So what are your views about legal flexibility?
So I think we need absolute legal flexibility, and I think from a regional level and you can see it through the existing structure of the EU or existing structure of regional fisheries management organisations, that you're setting up the tram lines or the barriers, the strategic direction, and then the implementation is done more to national level. So, for example, if we say take one ecosystem and we aim to protect 30% of that ecosystem, and it's in multiple states, well, then the discussion at the regional level is a trade-off between those states in terms of who's going to protect what percentage of that ecosystem, and if they're going to protect that, if they protect more of that ecosystem, what does another state do? What's the trade-offs there in terms of maybe one state produces more energy to meet the EU goals, and there's a trade-off between international commitments at a state level. But when it goes within the EEZ, we're not suggesting any removal of state sovereignty. But so once we've made the commitments at a regional level, there would be flexibility of how you implement at a national level. So we know, for example, that Ireland are developing, increasingly looking at what we term as DMAP, so designated marine areas processes, And so that wouldn't change the ability for people to do that. I think the flexibility comes in by moving to an ecosystem based and not EEZ. We have the ability to, and the setting of baselines is to have the ability to actually move some of these areas as climate change moves them. So have that legal flexibility, that so these lines aren't so static, because in 20-30 years time, the reason for an MPA being set up may or may no longer be relevant for that particular area. And so we absolutely need to investigate more having that legal flexibility and adaptability. But I can't say that we've got the exact answer right now. But if other people have got their expertise, we're more than happy to hear from you in ways we could achieve that.
Let us move to a big legal document. Well, we're staying at legal questions, called the Marine. It's a long name, the MSFD, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. I believe it's called in full naming. We have a question about the so-called ecoregions. If I recall correctly, there are 4 of those, meaning the Baltic Sea, Northeast Atlantic Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, and the Black Sea. A question that we have received is, how do they fit into our project? I mean, we are the Atlantic Arctic Lighthouse, huge area, literally from the polar region in the north, from the North Pole down to the Azores. Wide reach, not only oceans, but also freshwater. So ocean, catchment areas on land, on sea, rivers, lakes. But the Atlantic Arctic is not really one of those 4, if I'm informed correctly and remember correctly, one of those 4 ecoregion in the MSFD. Baltic Sea, Northeast Atlantic Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea. How do you see the MSFD ecoregion fit in there? And before I hand to you, you have 30 seconds to think, Oliver. Thank you again for the audience for listening and to stay with us. If you want to raise your hand, please do so. If you want to ask another question, please do so in the Q&A session. And I do see we haven't answered everything yet, but we're on our way to do so. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for engaging, and please continue to do so. So, Odi, now you had 30 seconds to think. What is your answer?
So from a mission ocean perspective, we're taking the Atlantic and Arctic Lighthouse. We are developing solutions or proposals now. The next phase of the mission is 2026 to 2030. That's when we are actually looking at that upscaling across different lighthouses and translating our solutions and indeed incorporating solutions from other areas. And so you're right, we would have to look at how the ecosystem approach we're proposing directly aligns with the ecoregions out of the Water Framework Directive, but I don't think it's necessarily a barrier. It's more about mapping those ecosystems in the first place, accounting for the catchment areas, that holistic, I refer to it personally as a mountains to sea approach. So I think it's very important, and we see states already addressing that. In terms of the specific ecoregions, I think it's about a discussion at a high level in terms of defining those ecoregions or ecosystems moving forward as the management units. But our specific project right now is very much Atlantic Arctic focused, but phase 2 is very much expanding into other areas. So we are already leveraging our experts that we've engaged, and not just in the Atlantic and Arctic. Our experts bring in and discussion we're having with other people already, as I mentioned, identifies different marine spatial planning in different areas and the incorporation of the Water Framework Directive as well. So I think it's a very interesting question. We haven't defined how that's going to be incorporated in the future, but we're very, very aware of it.
Do you have a success scenario in mind of like how European waters could look like in 20 years? That's not the final question, but do you have a success scenario in mind? Like what are you aiming at?
So not to be too not to put a number on it, but essentially we want to set up a framework that has an enduring legacy, so that mine and yours and everybody else's kids and generations to come have a management system that they can make their own decisions, but hopefully be in a better situation than we are now, with very clear decision roles and responsibilities. I think personally we need to address as part of these new governance proposals we're putting forward is the ability to tell people and communicate that about the efforts that we've got some fantastic restoration projects underway, we've got some fantastic MPAs, but we're not always able to show the biodiversity changes, the impact. Now, we always talk about the climate change crisis, but the biodiversity crisis is equally as important, but that does get less traction, and I think, or less media coverage, in my opinion. And I think sometimes that's because we can't demonstrate an impact. So my vision would be that we have actual measurable results into the future, and those measurable results are improving the marine ecosystem, not just for nature, but for multi-use. We're going to rely on it moving forward for our energy and our security, as I mentioned. So we have to account for those as part of our decision making.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Then we have, I believe, one question that we partially answered, but maybe not completely yet. When it comes to MPA zones managers, you also referred to a legal entity. Where do you see? Can you explain again where you see the issues about the current legal setup, about the legal entities? I understood that there are overlaps, that there are authorities in the same regions wanting the same thing with partially different measures. Which legal entity do you have in mind, if you have any in mind, that could solve this? Is it solvable?
I think all things are solvable, just with the will. I don't think there's a one case, one solution fits all here. We know that there's an increasing push around nature rights, or rights for nature, sorry. And we know that there's an example in Spain and an example in New Zealand and other places around the world where the environment itself has been given a legal right. And so then by having a legal right, then you have a position to push back on things that might impact your that particular environment, or indeed not just pushing back on things, but enabling yourself to implement programs so you can build revenue from monitoring programs. I think it's providing the ability for sites to do that nationally. I'm not sure we can dictate that from a regional level, because it will be case by case. France, there are already examples where we have management authorities that have obviously a legal basis. The benefit of those sort of circumstances means that you can establish revenue, and then that means you can support your monitoring and your compliance. You can build capital, talking to investments, banks or insurance. The issue, we have to be realistic, I think, in terms of how we set those up in terms of their legal entity. But I think we also need to be realistic about public funding is always getting squeezed, and we cannot continue to assume that all these MPAs are going to be able to just be supported through funding from the public purse. And that means we're going to continually say that we don't have the monitoring of an area, or we can't tell if it's being enforced correctly. So I think we have to think outside the box. I had some very interesting discussions recently about insurance. It's not a subject I generally follow up on, but in terms of insurance, you could make the argument that coastal resilience, or putting a MPA that builds coastal resilience, reduces the risks of the banks foregoing, or the people that own homes on that coastline foregoing on their loans, which turns into negative equity for the bank. And so therefore there's an investment proposition there for the bank to support an MPA that increases coastal resilience, which means those people that have houses aren't necessarily going to be foregoing on their loan, which is going to be negative from a bank's perspective. Now, I just see a question pop up there, Sebastian, about would it be the MPA be a legal entity? I think that's a very valid question. Is it is it the environment, the MPA itself, or is it the management authority that is a legal entity or has responsibilities? An example, again, there are examples where legislation has set up an area, and then there's a forum or that is given legal responsibility to manage it. So that's one way of doing it. Or the rights for nature, as I said, where the area itself is given kind of legal recognition. This is a very live discussion that's happening at the moment, and I think there are multiple options in which we could pursue it. But I think the key is understanding why you want to make it give it some legal agency. And I think from my perspective, it's very much about enabling that site to then move from, as I said, move from that research to that innovation to the business as usual. And so then they have more control over implementation, management, strategic direction, and maybe even moving some, maybe even then arguing that the lines on the map that they might be defined by need to be moved based on data. So I think that's a very interesting discussion that we need to advance.
Thank you. Then there are two last points that I would like you to refer to answer, that I would like to pose to you. One is an overarching theme that was touched upon particularly also today, which are the so-called ecosystem-based approaches. How can ecosystem-based approaches better integrate local and national governance frameworks compared to other approaches, or how could they approach nature in a better way? Let me rephrase this. How can ecosystem-based approaches be more beneficial for nature compared to zonal approaches? Because I believe that's part of what you would like to aim for, if I understood you correctly.
So I think from a local, regional or national level, it's integrating the objectives with the existing strategy. So we know with the baseline study we've conducted, we have the frameworks. There are frameworks is about how they're effectively implemented and monitored in terms of delivery. If there's a drive from a regional, international commitment level that you have to embed these into your regional strategies, then that would be strengthened, and then you again, those local councils would be obligated through legal frameworks to put ecosystem based as a fundamental when they're thinking about developing coastlines or they're looking at the jurisdictions. And I think that's where the interface, the mountains to sea approach. If a site has a legal entity, or if a site is recognized within the regions, it can then be an avenue to push for changes to what's coming down, in addition to the Water Framework Directive, in terms of water quality that's actually coming into our oceans, which if we put a marine protected area where there's lots of heavy metals coming into, we might have got our percentages, but we haven't got our impact. And so embedding ecosystem-based approaches will mean that there has to be a consideration for that moving forward. I think there are multiple ways we can do that in the local and national context. Again, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, and I think we have to be careful about impinging on sovereignties, national sovereignty, and also enabling people to have stewardship and decision-making processes at a local level. But there are papers out there in different ways we can achieve that.
Thank you. I want to refer to you something again in the chat about, like, you talked about legal entities, and the question is, like, at what point, under which conditions can an MPA become a legal entity? Do you want to go into that? And the question would be, do you have a specific, for example, Spanish example in mind of an area that does already have legal rights? So how do you become a legal entity as an MPA, and do you have a Spanish example?
So there is a Spanish example, but I apologize, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, so I have to take note, and I'll put it out following this. But there are examples. The one that comes to my head in terms of names is there's a Waikato River in New Zealand, which has a legal basis, and so then they have representatives who talk on behalf of the river in terms of any discussions or planning or strategic direction changes or government policies moving forward. So that's how it works in that case. In terms of an MPA, I think I touched on it earlier, whether or not the MPA itself is the entity, or if it's the marine protection area, whether you create legislation that says here is the MPA and here is the management authority that has legal agency to act on its behalf, and then it's the management area. Some of the discussions that I've been having at the moment is if it's the MPA, to get some of the benefits that I referred to in terms of kind of investment, capital building, and ongoing funding, there needs to be an entity for somebody to invest in and some security around. And so that's why I think realistically it'll be less about the site being an entity, but more the management authority. Now, I'm not suggesting every MPA has to have its individual management authority. You might have a management authority that is responsible for multiple MPAs. We have that in some cases already. It might be a state body. It doesn't have to be a private body. The issue with state body obviously then comes to how you incorporate and build funding and funding models, whereas if it's a private body, maybe that is a bit more flexible.
Thank you, Oliver. Then you lead me to the last point that I have, and this is intergenerational justice. You briefly talked about young persons, and also you have a long perspective in mind. So my question to you would be, how do you consider intergenerational engagement in justice? How do you see the role of so-called ECOPS, early career ocean professionals, so-called ECOPS, in this field? How should the concept of intergenerational justice be defined and applied specifically to ocean governance?
A big question for the last question, Sebastian.
We tried to end big.
So in terms of intergenerational, I think it's making sure that we have youth. Now, I'm a bit conflicted by this consistent term of youth and what that is always defined as and how that differs. But I do think having bodies of different age groups at representative tables and decision making, not just management or not just consultation, but actually deciding direction of travel is important. I think the ECOPs are incredibly important in terms of the evidence-based as well as informing strategic direction. Now, I do think there is an aspect here where we have to be careful about not exceeding what we can realistically achieve. It's about having people in the room and having the dialogue. But that's why I think it's about setting up a framework that is adaptable for future generations so that they can make their own decisions and be clear about who's making the decisions. There is lots of discussion about intergenerational justice, but I think we would, like I said earlier, we aren't the experts in all of these fields. And so we would very much seek to hear from people that are doing a lot of work in the intergenerational and how it might benefit us. We've been reaching out quite broadly and will continue to do so to continue to inform our approaches and our proposals moving forward. As I say, we do have the luxury under our work package and under BlueMissionAA generally to be thought provokers and to really push boundaries in terms of current thinking. And so if there are people on the line that are doing a lot of work in this space, please do reach out to us.
That's beautiful, Oliver. I'm going to hand to Anna in a minute for an outro, so to say. Before I'll do that, I want to thank both you again, Oliver, for being here today as work package lead of the important governance architecture program and work package in Blue Mission Atlantic Arctic. And to our audience of today, thank you so much for bearing with us today until now, and for handing in so many interesting questions. Please stay in touch. You have seen the QR code before. You will be able to find us online on BlueMissionAA for Atlantic Arctic online, so BlueMissionAA.eu. You will find us online. You will find Oliver, you will find Air Center, you will find Marine Institute, you will find myself, Sebastian, also on LinkedIn and on other pages. Please reach out, please connect. As Oliver said several times, we have the luxury to be thought provokers, and we want to have further thought provokers and to critically engage with you. So please keep the messages coming, and please continue engaging. What I understood from you today, Oliver, is you moved from across half of the world from New Zealand about a year ago. So you had just, so to say, your welcome back 1 year anniversary. Welcome back again. And in this year, you have managed quite a lot of work in governance. You're thinking big. You want to change things, have a healthier systems with a few not only of today, but also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for the insight today. I'm going to hand over to Anna now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Oliver, and Sebastian for such a good moderation. Oliver, for so much information, such a great insight on ocean governance. I know I should end the session, but I would really just want to make one question for Oliver. So the goal is set to protect 30% till 2030. How far are we from that target?
I think if you actually look at people's percentages that are reporting, I think we are still quite far. We absolutely, that's the problem in terms of the urgency versus setting up a system that will be enduring. But I would flip that question slightly and say, I'm less. We obviously have international obligations, so we need to reach these percentages. I'm less concerned personally about a percentage and more about the impact of the areas we protect. And so I think we need to change our mindset.
That was my following question, is that do we face the risk of having marine protected areas on paper and not actually effective marine protected areas?
I think not to be too controversial, but if we wanted to protect 30% now, we probably could by just putting a couple of nautical miles right on the edge of everybody's EEZ, which is less conflict and less concern, and you'd have your 30%. But that's not really what the 30% is about. It's not what we're striving for, which is why the work that Sebastian and I are doing is very much trying to turn that discussion from a percentage to what's the actual impact. And projects like I say, we're not doing this alone. Projects like Marine Plan, that are looking at biodiversity hotspots, like MPA Europe looking at biodiversity hotspots. I mean, just the amount of information, and they'll come now about ecosystem-based approaches. But what I don't think we've done yet is change our strategic direction to reflect that information that's coming out.
Yeah. So thank you for all your input, Oliver and Sebastian. Thank you for the audience for engaging in this webinar, and there are good news for the audience. In about 2 weeks, we'll have Oliver and Sebastian back in the room for another webinar. This time, advancing governance for scalable marine restoration. So please return in 2 weeks for a follow-up session. And just before that, next week we'll have another weekly hour on with the project Future Lakes on the restoration of freshwater habitats. So everyone, thank you again, and I will see you next week.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks, Sebastian. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you. We're not live anymore, right?
No, I don't think so.